Welcome, everyone. I am Courtney Cheetah with Wild Farm Alliance, and thanks for joining us today. This is our ninth lesson of 10 in the Role of Birds on Midwest Farms webinar series. Since 2000, we've been working with farmers to achieve healthy, viable agriculture that protects and restores wild nature. We have a 2050 vision in our 3 program areas where we aim to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms in our Farmland Flyways program, hedgerows of habitat the length of To the Moon and Back, which is about 500,000 miles in our Farmland Wildways program, and 10% of river frontage on farms planted as farmland waterways, leading to 100,000 miles of ravine habitat. There are an array of different publications and videos in our resource section of our website, including a publication on nesting structures for beneficial songbirds on Midwest farms and a beneficial bird native plant chart for the upper Midwest. We are super excited to let you know that we have a new video that's on our homepage that spotlights the tree swallows eating flies on livestock farms. And you'll see Hannah Bernhardt of Medicine Creek Farm and Mary and Brian Keeter, 2 of our previous speakers in this series from Harmony Hills, and they're highlighting their research on their farm as well. Today's webinar is on the semi-natural habitats and birds as pest managers with Karina Garcia, an agroecologist currently at Hanson Brook Farms, and Daniel Garcia, a professor and biologist at the University of Oviedo in Spain. And later this month, we'll be having our last lesson, which will be on birds at risk, how pesticides shape safety on agricultural lands. And that'll be on April 28th. 11 a.m. Central Standard Time, and we hope you will join us then. We are offering 1 credit of continuing education credit from the American Agronomy Society. To receive that credit, please have your license number handy and enter it into the evaluation form, which we'll be sharing at the end of today's webinar. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We're going to start today with Karina sharing her research and information. So I'll let you share your screen and we'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, hi everyone. Let me quickly start sharing.
Perfect, that looks great.
Awesome. Hi everyone, super excited to be here today talking about the role of semi-natural habitat and supporting avian pest control in organic strawberry production. I did this research while I was in grad school at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky, which is where I currently live. However, most of this research was done on the California Central Coast, but hopefully you still find this interesting and of use. So as this group probably very well knows, summarizing or generalizing the role of birds in agriculture can be pretty complicated due to the different functions of different bird groups and different bird species. Because on one hand, we can have beneficial birds like insectivorous birds, which act as generalist predators of arthropods in agroecosystems. But we also have some birds that partake in frugivory or herbivory, and that sometimes translates as those birds acting as pests to crops. So if we look at a diagram that summarizes the net effects of birds in agroecosystems, in this particular example, a strawberry agroecosystem, we see that one potential pathway in which birds can negatively impact crop yield and profit is through direct crop consumption. In some instances, birds can be costly to agricultural production. This study in 2013 found that for 5 fruit crops across 5 states, birds caused nearly $189 million in damage. Additionally, there's a growing concern about the role of birds in vectoring and transmitting pathogens associated with foodborne illnesses, such as infectious E. coli and salmonella. So here we have another negative potential pathway in which fecal contamination can be seen as a food safety threat, and another way in which birds can negatively impact an agroecosystem. However, some birds can provide benefits to growers by suppressing insect pests. We've seen this in coffee, corn, wine grapes, and I'm sure many other examples that have been highlighted throughout this course series. So here we can add a pathway in which insectivorous birds can positively impact agroecosystems by providing pest control of arthropod pests. However, there's also the chance that these insectivorous birds, which again are generalist predators typically, can partake in intraguild predation, and they can consume arthropod natural enemies that we generally consider to be beneficial, such as big-eyed bugs or spiders, or many others. To add to the complexity of bird net effects in agroecosystems, we also have birds of prey that can consume pest birds, which would be beneficial, but they might also consume beneficial birds, which would be not so beneficial. So, in summary, measuring net effects is important. Without measuring net effects, the wrong management decision might be taken, such as excluding potentially beneficial birds. We have a powerful tool or method to measure net effects, and I know this has been talked about by some of the previous presentations in this course, which I think just highlights how useful of a method this is. And it's an exclusion experiment in strawberries in 2015, actually, a pilot study that led us to expanding this project. So we did this bird exclusion experiment in strawberries where we had the control plot that allowed birds to have access to the strawberries. So here we expected to see more bird damage, but potentially less insect damage. Whereas in our exclosure plots, we expected to see less bird damage and perhaps more insect damage. And that is indeed what we saw. We saw that for bird damage, there was a higher percentage of berry damaged birds in our control plots where birds had access relative to the exclosure experiments. And for insect damage, we found that there was a higher percentage of insect damaged berries where birds were excluded. This is what damage by the lygus bug typically looks like. Lygus bugs are hemipterans, so they have sucking mouth parts, and their damage results in the malformation of these strawberries. They get this puckered look to them, and that basically renders the strawberries unmarketable. Farmers are not able to sell these strawberries. They typically get cold or thrown away, so that typically results in food waste. So from this pilot study in 2015, what we ultimately saw was that the amount of damage of berries being damaged was similar to the amount of berries that birds were preventing from being damaged. So in this particular experiment, we found that birds were essentially net neutral. So our group, our team was interested in finding out how we could move that needle to be so birds could be overall positive in the system. I'm sorry, the total opposite of what I meant to say, but yeah, how we could shift the bird community to being positive in this agroecosystem. So while exclosure experiments give us an idea of what the overall net effects are, we still had some missing puzzle pieces. Overall, from the exclosure experiment and what we know about net effects, we know that net effects are context specific, right? They're going to be heavily influenced by your region, your landscape, your farm management methods, your crop species. These are going to dictate your bird community, your arthropod natural enemy community, and your overall pest community, and then interactions between all of these different biotic and abiotic factors are going to result in whether your net effects are positive, neutral, or negative, and what actions you might want to take. But from this exclosure experiment, what we still didn't know was which bird species were delivering these key services and disservices, and which local and landscape level factors were influencing whether we were seeing more beneficial or harmful birds. So here we use a combination of tools, molecular DNA-based tools, to identify which bird species were providing services and which were providing disservices, and then also ecological approaches to see how these groups changed in response to local and landscape gradients. So from this exposure experiment, we developed a larger study in which we wanted to describe the diet of birds that forage in this organic strawberry farm system. We wanted to determine which bird species were consuming ligas and which were consuming strawberries. We wanted to determine how bird communities shifted across local and landscape gradients. So that's for all the birds in this network. And then also specifically for ligas and strawberry eating birds, we wanted to see how those groups shifted across local and landscape gradients. There was a lot of methods to the study, and I'll cover some of these in detail, starting with our study system. Again, this study was in the California Central Coast, which is an economically important strawberry growing region. Even here in the grocery stores in Lexington, Kentucky, I see that a lot of the strawberries that we get here are from these regions. So a super important region for strawberries. We had 20 sites that varied in landscape composition and local diversification. Here's just some pictures of what some of those farms look like, some of the different features that they had, some flower strips, some greater crop diversity. This farmer was growing a variety of trees alongside his strawberries. And then this picture I like because it highlights one of the few organic compliant methods that strawberry farmers have in the region, which is a tractor mounted vacuum. Essentially, they will vacuum the entire strawberry plants and they just suck up all the insects and shred them to bits. It's really kind of a bizarre tool that sometimes works for the farmers. And an interesting observation is that sometimes we see barn swallows and cliff swallows following right behind because they know that a bug vac equals treats being dispersed up into the air. But moving back to my objectives, the first, which was to describe the diet of birds that forage in organic strawberry farms. Here we collected birds with mist nets, collected fecal samples, did DNA extraction of those fecal samples, and did DNA analysis to identify which birds were eating ligas, which birds were eating strawberries, and to just describe their diets overall. I believe a couple of other presenters have also touched on this method, and this is just a really powerful research method that has become available to researchers over the last decade or so, and is really great at sort of allowing us to describe diets of birds and other specimens that are hard to see through just foraging observations. So super exciting stuff. After filtering for low reads and filtering for high quality samples, we had 423 samples. Here on the x-axis, we have the bird species, and the y-axis is the number of samples that we have for each of those species. We got a lot of samples from some bird species and very few from others. Most of our samples came from song sparrows, followed by house finches, dark-eyed juncos, Oregon juncos out there, out west, spotted towhees, and California towhees. And then we just wanted to look at some general trends of bird diets in this area because it's pretty difficult to determine what birds are eating, like I said, through foraging observations. And yeah, we found that these 5 first orders made up 76% of all diet items. So flies, diptera, spiders. So again, we're seeing intraguild predation there, hemiptera, coleoptera beetles, and lepidoptera butterflies and moths. And with this diet data, we were also able to see which strawberry pests birds were eating. These are all listed as strawberry pests by the UC IPM website. So with this data set, we also wanted to determine which birds consume ligas and which were consuming strawberries. In order to classify which birds consume ligas or strawberry, we limited we limited this analysis to birds that we had at least 5 samples for. For Lygus species eaters, we adopted a 15% frequency of occurrence approach, meaning that 15% of the samples that we had for this particular bird species had to have Lygus detected in its diet 15% at the time. For strawberry eaters, we also adopted a 15% frequency of occurrence threshold, but we used two metrics. We used 15% frequency of occurrence for testing positive for a targeted strawberry primer that we used, and 15% of the samples also had to have what we called berrybill, which was essentially when birds had build up strawberry residue or build up on their bills. And then, of course, we had some birds that were consistently eating both Lygus and strawberries, including my all-time favorite bird, the California quail, which I miss dearly. But yeah, this is what berrybill looked like for this house finch in the middle. And again, house finches were one of our consistent strawberry eaters. So overall, we found that 15 birds were consuming Lygus on a regular basis, whereas we found that 8 bird species were consuming strawberries on a regular basis, and there was 5 birds that were consuming both. As I mentioned earlier, we had 20 study sites that varied in landscape complexity, with some farms like the one on the left having greater amounts of semi-natural cover in the landscape, denoted by these green patches, whereas the farm on the right, the yellow, is representing agriculture. As you can see, a lot less natural, semi-natural vegetation. So 2 very different farms in our study, just highlighting the gradient that we were working in. For each of our sites, we also calculated crop diversity within 500 meters of our sampling sites. To do this, we just drove around and mapped all of the different crops. And from this same data set, we were also able to calculate the proportion of strawberry cover in the landscape. We also collected information about local diversification features at each of our farms. This was looking at the 50-meter radius. That was also the same sort of distance that we use for our bird counts. So we looked at crop diversity, semi-natural habitat at the local scale, so woody vegetation, flower strips, pretty much any non-crop vegetative cover. We also noticed that farms tended to vary in terms of how weedy they were. There were some farms that were super manicured, and then there were some farms that were a little more wild. We thought that might be important, so we also recorded that. And then we also took note of the different number of strata types available at each farm. For bird surveys, we conducted 10-minute, 50-meter fixed radius bird surveys. We had 1 to 6 bird survey locations per farms, depending on the size of the farm. Our smallest farm only allowed for 1 bird survey, 1 50-meter bird survey, and then we just had a max of 6. Each site was surveyed over 3 consecutive days, just to meet the assumptions for the analysis method that we were using. And then just for detection, we also took note of the wind level, noise level, how many people were present, because these were active farms. There was often a lot of people harvesting the strawberries. Time of day was also collected during each bird survey. Not going to go into the analysis methods too much, but essentially we ran our model for all birds in our study, and then we also ran it for just the subset of Lygus eating birds and strawberry eating birds. And starting with Lygus eating birds first, what we found was that semi-natural habitat at the local scale was positively influenced the abundance of our Lygus eating birds. This analysis method also allows us to see species-specific responses. So here we see some of those species-specific responses, and then just overall the abundance of the lygus-eating birds increasing with increasing proportion of semi-natural habitat at that 50-meter farm scale. For strawberry eaters, interestingly enough, we found no significant relationship between strawberry eating bird abundance and any of the local and landscape variables that we were looking at. For our full species model, just for detection, we found that wind level negatively influenced whether birds were detected. Not super surprising, as when it's windy, birds tend to hunker down, and the wind might also affect whether we can accurately hear birds. And for the full species model, we found both a positive impact of semi-natural habitat in the landscape and local scales. And again, just looking at species-specific responses and the overall abundance of all the birds, we see that that's increasing with semi-natural habitat in the landscape. Richness followed the same trend. We found that richness increased with increasing semi-natural habitat at both the local and landscape scale. So overall, we found that the proportion of semi-natural habitat at the landscape scale is key for bird conservation and diversity overall of birds within this network of strawberry farms. We found that semi-natural habitat at the farm scale may be promoting lygus-eating birds. And we found that strawberry eating bird abundance didn't change across any of the local or landscape metrics that we were looking at. And I think I will leave it there.
Awesome. That was really, really cool to see all that awesome data. I'm going to have us launch the poll questions and people can answer those. And there is one question in the chat we can kind of talk about. Is patchiness on the landscape good? And with the idea that like robins aren't really afraid of humans so much.
Is patchiness on the landscape good? Robin's not afraid of humans so much. I guess it depends on, I'm not exactly sure what the question's asking in terms of like patchiness. I guess it depends what patches we're asking about. But if they're semi-natural patches, I think that's generally good because it sort of provides patches or provides sort of a connection for birds to be able to move through the landscape.
Okay, why don't we stop that, share the results. Karina, do you want to go over these?
Yeah. So first question was, which statement best reflects how semi-natural habitat influences bird communities? It looks like almost everyone got this right. So both farm and landscape scale habitat influence birds in this particular study. That might vary depending on region or where you're doing your study. But I think there's other studies that also show that both local and landscape levels habitat influences bird abundance. And in this case, it influenced bird abundance and bird diversity. 2, what is the expected outcome of increasing semi-natural habitat without farms? Again, for this particular study, it increased pest-eating birds without the abundance of pest-eating birds without increasing our strawberry or crop-damaging birds. Yeah.
Nice. Excellent. Awesome. And if anybody has a question for Karina, feel free to put it in the chat. And we'll switch over to Daniel and let him do his presentation. Then we can do more Q&A at the end. And well, I got one question while Daniel gets his lined up. Joanne wants to know if you mean hedgerows, windbreaks, filter strips, or grassed waterways for semi-natural habitat. How do you define that?
Yeah, we were pretty inclusive with our definition of semi-natural habitat. So we included all of these things. A lot of these features were present at some of the farms we were at. I definitely remember hedgerows, windbreaks, filter strips, a little less common, but we did have some of those, and grass waterways, also a little bit less common, but we pretty much included any non-crop vegetation as semi-natural habitat.
Cool.
Okay, so thank you very much for your invitation to take part of this very interesting seminars and courses, and I'm really happy to be here and to share with Wild Farm Alliance and all of you some of my experience on birds and agriculture. And today I'm going to talk about the effect of woody habitats in the pest control provided by birds. But I want also to talk and highlight that woody habitats matter for birds, but birds might also matter for woody habitat, may benefit woody habitats if there is some kind of reciprocity in this relationship. So these are the main points of my talk. I would like to start by remembering that birds are quite important as pest managers in different kinds of crops, and I will focus especially on woody crops where forests, especially forest birds, are going to be interesting and so they are going to receive some positive effects of woody habitats. Then I will talk about this woody habitat bird reciprocity, which is based on the fact that birds can disperse the seeds of plants that shape woody habitats. So the seed dispersal process is the important thing, and I'm going to show some evidence from our recent studies about these topics by focusing on a quite a specific study system, which is the Asturian cider apple orchards in northern Spain. And then finally, I will try to translate all this kind of scientific information in an applied language useful for farmers. So most of you and most of farmers really know that wild birds may be very helpful for croplands by providing this ecosystem service of pest controls. And well, Karina has already talked about this, but well, I would like also to highlight that we can um, distinguish the different kinds of pest control syndromes depending on the type of the crop and the kind of habitat that the crop itself shapes for birds, depending if this is a grassy crop that is going to provide an open habitat for birds, or depending if it's a woody crop that is going to shape a kind of closed habitat for birds, and also depending on the size of the taxonomy of the pest. For example, distinguishing between invertebrate pests, mostly insect, versus vertebrate pests that are going to be preyed by smaller, bigger birds like birds of prey and raptors, compared to the insectivorous birds that are going to be the main pest controllers and pest managers of insects and arthropods in both open and closed croplands. So I'm going to focus on this kind of woody crops where forest habitats, forest birds are going to be really useful because they are used to move in this kind of closed canopies, and woody habitats around these woody crops are going to be important for birds because they are going to provide shelter, food, these kind of different kinds of food, and also nesting sites. And where are these kind of woody habitats in croplands? We might consider, for example, the hedgerows around the croplands, also the forest patches very close to the adjacent to the cropland, but also at some distance in the landscape from the croplands, from the farms. But also we can also even consider that the crop tree canopy may represent also a woody habitat for relevant for birds. So we can assume that there is this kind of positive effect of woody habitat on birds by providing shelter, food, and nesting sign. But there is, as I told you, a sort of reciprocity because the same birds, or many of the same birds, are going to be able to feed on fleshy fruits and seeds from the plants inhabiting woody habitats and provide a service of seed dispersal that is going to affect the regeneration process of the plants in woody habitats. So birds are going to contribute to the long-term maintenance of these woody plants in woody habitats. So having these ideas in mind, we have been working during the last 10 years in this system of apple orchards in Asturias region, which is there in the north of Spain, the Cantabrian coast, and where most of the apple production is devoted to the production of cider, because cider is a very relevant product in the region, both in cultural and social terms. So most of the crops, most of the yield is devoted to cider production. And apple orchards are widespread across all the region. We may see this kind of cider apple orchard all over the region. And a quite important thing is that they are managed and they are cultivated in a quite traditional and low input and low intensity management regimes. So we have been working in a high number of different orchards, trying to represent the environmental variability of orchards in different terms. For example, at the level of landscape, we have been looking for orchards that with a high contact with hedgerows in their edges. Also, looking for different landscapes characterized by different covers of forest, semi-natural forest at a 1 kilometer distance. But also we have been looking for orchards that differ in the degree of cover provided by apple tree canopies. So on all these orchards, we have been monitoring the birds communities by direct sampling. We have been also capturing birds by means netting and taking also this kind of fecal samples for analyzing the diet, as Karina told us, by using DNA metabarcoding techniques. We have been also sampling the abundance of different major pests, like for example the codling moth, the apple worm, which is probably the most important pest in apple crop. And also we have also evaluated the global effect of the total effect of birds in terms of controlling the abundance and the biomass of arthropods and pests by using also this kind of small scale disclosure experiments. And these are the main result of these samples. The first thing is that we have found a highly diverse community of birds within the orchards. Most of them were birds that we can classify as forest insectivorous birds. There you have some of the main species with the different relative abundance, and you may see that there is a taxonomic variability, but also there is a quite high functional variability. We have birds of different sizes, different shapes, different morphologies, and also different foraging behaviors. And also probably the most important thing is that we have found quite clear effects of the occurrence of woody habitat at different scales on birds communities, on the structure of bird communities. For example, we know that there is a positive relationship between the apple canopy cover at the orchard level and the abundance of forest insectivorous birds inside the orchards. Whereas the richness of birds, the number of forest insectivorous bird species, depend more on the contact with hedgerow, the quantity of hedgerows around each orchard in the closest neighborhood. But also there is an effect at a larger scale because the richness also increases in those orchards that have a higher proportion of woody vegetation, mostly semi-natural forests, in this landscape at a larger scale. We have been analyzing the diet of the birds, and by using this kind of arthropod DNA metabarcoding, and we have been able to identify which pest species occurs in the fecal samples of the different bird species. We have organized all these kind of occurrences of pests on birds in this kind of interaction network, where I'm representing in the upper row the bird species. Every rectangle represents a different bird species. No? In the lower row is the same for the pest species. Every rectangle represents one pest species, and the size of the rectangle is proportional to the frequency of occurrence of the pest in the whole sample. And every link is every interaction between a bird species and a pest species. For example, this gray tit and this golden moth. I have represented in different colors different groups of species and interactions in something what we call different modules in the network, and represented the modularity of the networks. The modules in the interaction network represent subsets of species and interactions that occur in a frequency higher than expected from the random encounter of species in the orchard. What does this mean? This means that different bird species are selecting actively different pest species as prey, as their prey. So we can expect a high functional complementarity between different bird species at the time of providing the pest control service. This is going to increase the magnitude of pest control service having different bird species in our orchards. We also know that from a closure experiment that at least in our case, birds might have a very strong pest control effect regarding the pest and regarding the population of arthropods. And there you have represented the biomass of arthropods in branches open to the birds, open branches where apple branches where birds can access and eat directly the arthropods and pests on the branches, and the biomass of arthropods in the branches excluded to the birds inside these kind of cages in the same trees, paired in the same tree. You may see that when we exclude the branches, the biomass of arthropods multiplies by 4. In other words, birds are reducing in 80% the biomass of arthropods and the biomass of pests attacking apple trees in our orchards. So the capacity, the ability of birds for controlling pests is really high. And finally, more recently, we are working with complex mathematical modeling, trying to predict the abundance of pests, for example, the abundance of golden moth, depending on the composition of the communities of birds inhabiting every orchard. That is going to depend on the habitat features, especially related with the occurrence of woody habitats affecting these communities of birds. So we have found with these predictive models, we have found that we can expect lower densities of golden moths in those orchards, mostly composed by insectivorous birds. So this characteristics is representing how important are those birds that have a diet based mostly on arthropods within the community of birds visiting the orchards. So the more insectivorous birds, the lower the density of golden moths. But probably the most important or the most interesting thing with this modeling approach is that we can try to evaluate different measures of management, changing, for example, the characteristics of the orchard related to woody habitats in terms of the effect on pest control. For example, here we are simulating the changes in the density of golden moth when we increase by management, for example, the length of hedgerows around the orchards, the cover of apple tree canopies within the orchard, and the cover of forests just close to the apple orchards. You may see that increasing the apple tree canopies, and especially increasing the cover of forest adjacent to the orchard, is going to have a very strong effect of decreasing even more the density of pests by providing suitable habitat for insectivorous birds. So this is all of this is in relation to the pest control, but then let's talk also about the seed dispersal process. We have also analyzing the occurrence of plant remains in the diet of birds, assuming that these plant remains, also detected by DNA metabarcoding, are going to indicate the occurrence of seed dispersal, and we are also building an interaction network between bird species visiting the orchard and the plant species dispersed by the different types of birds. So most of them are fleshy, all of them are fleshy fruited plants in habit very typical from hedgerows and the adjacent forests to the orchard. For example, blackberries, brambles, ivies, hawthorns, blackthorns, etc. A lot of different species, in fact. So we have two different interaction networks. We have a pest control network, but also we have a seed dispersal network that they share the same bird species. So in some way we can merge these two different interaction networks in a single hybrid network when we can represent the interaction with pests and interaction with plants from the same bird species. And the interesting point of this hybrid network representation is that we can look at the position of the different bird species, the different nodes, the different dots are different bird species in red, distinguishing, for example, birds that occupy a peripheral position in the network because they mostly interact with pests. They are most heavily insectivorous birds that they don't participate too much in seed dispersal processes. But there are also other species, bird species like, for example, blackcaps, European robins, thrushes, or also blackbirds that are occupying central position in this network. This means that they are both providing pest control and seed dispersal service. They are connecting through the interaction network both ecosystem services in the same orchards at the same time. And finally, we can find that the most important characteristic of this central species is their abundance. It's precisely the commonest species that are more central in the network, that are more important for connecting both ecosystem services in the orchards. So how can we translate all this ecological jargon and all these ecological ideas into management and into agricultural terms, interesting for and useful for farmers? We have seen that bird biodiversity is important for the provision of pest control and seed dispersal ecosystem services, and we also know that this bird biodiversity is filtered by the environmental context of the orchard, especially related with the occurrence of woody habitats. So let's try to express these ideas in terms of guidelines for evidence-based management by farmers. So we know that apple tree cover at the orchard level is quite important for providing habitat and protection for birds. We are going to find a higher abundance of birds in those orchards, maintaining high cover of trees. So let's say to the farmers to avoid excessive pruning and tree clearance, for example, from one year to another. No? We also know that the occurrence of native hedgerows is relevant, both in quantity. We could advocate for maintaining at least 50% of perimeter around each orchard occupied by native hedgerows, but the quality of hedgerows is also relevant. No? we may suggest to encourage to have hedgerows mostly composed by fleshy fruited woody species, hawthorns and hollies, and a lot of different species are possible, because they are going to provide not only shelter, but also a very relevant food type, especially during the fall and the winter season for birds. And finally, we might also know that forest patches, even at some distance from the orchard, are relevant for providing birds into the orchards. No? So we can encourage to the in this case to farmers communities, and also to land managers, to conserve forest patches at the landscape scale, at a larger scale. So just to sum up, we have seen that forage insectivorous may be very common in this kind of low input woody crops, and it is quite clear that they may be very good at controlling pests as pest managers. It is quite also clear that this kind of forest insectivorous birds are going to be favored by woody habitat occurring at different scales, not only at the landscape scale with surrounding semi-natural forest, but also at a very local scale through the canopy of crop trees within the orchard, but also the occurrence of native hedgerows in orchard borders. But also we know that birds may also benefit these woody habitats, especially hedgerows and adjacent forests, by dispersing the seeds of these fleshy fruited plants, and by contributing to the long-term regeneration and the maintenance of these woody habitats around the croplands. And finally, it's also important that farmers themselves can increase this feedback between pest control, birds, and woody habitat. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll be happy to answer your question.
Excellent. Let's post the poll questions. People have a chance to answer those. And there's a question about, did you assess the distance at which forest patches influence bird communities?
Well, Mario, okay. Did you assess the distance at which forest patches influences bird communities?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, mostly at a short distance. We have been looking at the effect of the forest cover at different distance, and for example, with these predictive models, the effect was much higher when we look at the 100 meters or 200 meters distance from the orchard. So the immediate neighborhood is very important. But in any case, this is for the effect on pest control. In any case, well, we know that at least up to 1 kilometer distance, the occurrence of forest cover may be relevant.
Okay, sounds great. Let's end the poll and we can have you go through those questions.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, the first one, choose the actions that favor birds as pest manager, and all the people is really right. So don't use herbicides and don't use bird deterrents, at least for favoring pest controllers, and preserve hedgerows, maintain adjacent forest patches, and avoid the excessive clearing of fruit trees, because we know that the canopy cover inside the orchard is also relevant. Very good. And choose the plant types to create hedgerow on your farm. And for me, the most correct one are having perennial native trees. It's good to have perennial trees, because they are going to protect, to give shelter also during the winter. No? Avoid of course, the fast-grow exotic conifers. Perennial herbs, well, I don't think that they are important. No? Probably it's better to focus on woody plants. No? Fleshy fruited native trees are really important for providing not only shelter but also food. And well, bramble-like shrubs, they can work quite well too. At least here, the blackberry is quite important for providing a lot of fruits for birds, and they are quite dense. But they are not very tall, but they are quite dense. No? So they can provide a lot of shelter for birds too. So great.
Thank you. There's another question from Danny. So it
Yeah.
seems that the modern way of growing apple trees, where trees are trellised and very short, would not be the best orchard habitat for birds. What do you think about
No,
that?
no, not. No, it's not very good for birds. They can occur, no? Because there, for example, there are apple production, intensive apple production in northern Italy, for example, where they use this kind of trellis planting structure. But the diversity of birds, and especially the diversity of insectivorous birds and forest insectivorous, that they move quite well on trees and on branches, is going to decrease a lot.
Interesting. So not using dwarf rootstock would make sense to like have more bird
Yeah,
habitat.
well, I think the idea is almost to reproduce a kind of forest, no? But with
Mhm.
bigger trees and perhaps avoiding this lining and this linear structure, and with no much canopy cover
Mhm.
at
Nice.
the orchard scale.
Yeah. Is there any other questions? Oh, we got one from Joanne here. What did you
Yeah,
did you
there are
say
other questions.
that hedgerows should be surrounding 50% of the orchards because of how the birds move into the orchard, or does it have to do with the number of bird species that will be present? And then also
Yeah, well,
with
the quantity,
hedgerow.
establishing a quantity is a quite relative. No? I was talking about 50% because, well, this probably is going to ensure a minimum quantity of the edge of the border, providing suitable habitat. But well, we have seen that the length of the hedgerow is important for the abundance of birds. So it's important for the conservation of birds. But finally, it's not so important for um, favoring these kind of species that are going to provide the best pest control service. But anyway, should the heritage surround 50 of every 10-acre orchard or more? Well, it's difficult for me to work with these kind of measures of surface. I'm more used to hectares, but I will try to think on a scale independent quantity to it's clear that well, the smaller the the orchard, the higher is going to be the effect of the hedgerow for a standard quantity of hedgerow. So perhaps when you use larger surfaces or larger areas, you should increase the percentage of orchard in the landscape.
There's
Yeah,
a question.
the title of Garcia et al. 2024 is you have, I think that you have this paper. There is a link to
Yes.
this paper okay, is there. Common
Yep.
birds.
I just put the
Thank you.
the title there, and that'll also be on the resource page for this webinar as well, where the
Yeah.
recording will be. And yeah, you'll be able to find that. No problem. And there was a question about, have you studied this in other apple orchards, like other nuts or other fruits?
No, not actually, because there is no much other fruit production in our region. We have some deep contact with some colleagues working in the south of Spain, working in olive orchards, and they are finding quite similar results, at least regarding the effect of woody habitats on the diversity of birds. We have been working on also on blueberry orchards in Asturias, but the total cover of blueberry orchards in Asturias is quite low, and we found different results. There, the birds they don't exert a strong effect as pest controller, because the quantity of insects attacking or living on blueberry plants is quite low, because these blueberry are not original from Europe. They are in fact American varieties. So it seems that the insectivorous birds are not very attracted to the to the orchards, and there are also some damages to fruits that are quite by some kind of birds like blackberries.
Excellent. There's another question for Karina. Did you find that with a diversity of semi-natural habitat, there were higher diversity of bird species there, and that they cause less damage and less food safety problems?
Yeah, so we didn't look at the diversity of semi-natural habitat for our study. We just looked at the sort of the the percent cover of semi-natural habitat. But we did find that there was increasing bird diversity, species richness with increasing semi-natural habitat in the cover. And we also did find, I didn't get to touch on it, but we did an additional analysis where we looked at the multifunctionality of all birds in our study, where we essentially weighed services against disservices, including not only whether they consumed ligas and consumed strawberries, but also whether they were partaking in intraguild predation, or whether they were carriers of any pathogens related to food safety. And we found that, so we created an index. So then we measured the multifunctionality index against semi-natural cover in the landscape, and found that the index increased as semi-natural cover in the landscape increased, meaning that we had higher services accompanied by less disservices as we had more semi-natural cover in the landscape. So overall, semi-natural habitat cover in the landscape was great for sort of maximizing the positive net effects of birds in this particular region.
Excellent. So I'm going to cut us off. We're over time already. Thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge. Thanks for everyone for attending.
Thank you.
This Role of Birds on Midwest Farms webinar series is part of a professional development grant from the North Central region of SARE. So thank you, SARE, for making this possible. We would love your feedback. If you need CE credits, we need your license number. So make sure to use that link that's in the chat to fill that out. And anybody who responds will be entered into a drawing to win a super cool Wild Farm Alliance hat. So make sure you fill that out. There are links to all of the resources and resource papers that are related to this webinar on the resource page. And that's also where the recording will be. And we hope to see you at our next webinar on the 28th. Thanks so much for attending.